Hello, here I am again. I am Bob Rise, friends, allies, dreamers of change. Today we are here because we believe in something greater than ourselves. The right to build a future based on freedom, democracy, and the possibility of trading without barriers or impositions. Aurora could not afford isolation. Aware of this, the Council worked tirelessly to restore international trust. They re-established ties with former allies and negotiated a financial strategy that would provide stability to the businesses that, enticed by gold, had left the country. As an intermediate solution, they designed an adjustment period in which gold and Aurora would coexist, allowing for an orderly transition, mitigating the risks of collapse, and laying the foundations for a new economic era. With a forward-looking vision, they positioned Aurora as a digital financial hub, establishing agreements with nations interested in modernizing their economies and distancing themselves from traditional systems. But in every negotiation with world leaders, a recurring question arose. What should be done about Elios? The strategy to weaken him. The dilemma was monumental. Should they officially remove him from power and face the consequences of a political crisis, or let his own arrogance lead him to ruin? Ultimately, the Council chose not to confront him directly. Instead, they devised a strategy of attrition, gradually eroding his influence, allowing the pressure from the people, businesses, and the justice system to do the work on its own. Elios' fate was sealed by a devastating paradox. What he had built as the absolute emblem of his vision, the gold, ended up becoming the greatest contradiction of his government. The obsession that defined his identity would, in the end, be his greatest weakness. During his tenure, Aurora was redesigned under Elios' ideal of opulence, gleaming buildings, an aesthetic saturated with brilliance, and an unwavering devotion to ostentation. For him, gold was not merely a precious metal, but the very essence of power and prestige. However, his influence was not confined to Aurora's borders. In Monolythia, the opposing nation, his actions sparked a renewed appreciation for gold, turning it into the cornerstone of their financial strategy. Ironically, those who challenged him ended up embracing the very standard he had glorified, undermining the technological revolution he sought to lead with Aurora. As Elios convinced himself that his cryptocurrency was the ultimate symbol of his dominance, his unchecked rhetoric had the opposite effect. In his eagerness to consolidate his vision, he inadvertently drove his adversaries to resist change and cling to what he considered a relic of the past. Without realizing it, his own grandiloquence was unraveling the very structure of his project. Elios was isolated. The man who had sought to make gold the ultimate symbol of his power found himself trapped in his own contradiction, a prisoner of his own obsession. As he watched his control over Aurora crumble, his greatest rival, Monolythia, was turning the same metal into the cornerstone of its growing influence. Monolythia, Aurora's direct adversary, embodied everything Elios claimed to fight against. Yet his own legacy ultimately paved the way for the rise of this regime. In that country, privacy was non-existent. A massive network of cameras and microphones ensured constant surveillance of every citizen. Freedom of expression had no place, and any attempt at dissent was met with immediate punishment, arbitrary imprisonment without the right to a fair trial. Its culture was built upon extreme uniformity. Democracy was seen as a threat to its political model, replaced by an ideology that glorified homogeneity and rejected any expression of diversity. Citizens were required to work under strict conditions, with no possibility of demanding better wages or labor rights. To fully integrate into society, they had to be members of the unique party, the sole power structure that ruled with absolute authority. Monolythia ruled with an iron fist, sustaining its regime through fear and constant surveillance. Aurora's democracy and freedom posed a direct threat to its existence. However, the gold, promoted by Elios as the emblem of his greatness, became the foundation of power for his greatest adversary. While Elios clung to ostentation, Monolythia transformed the same metal into a tool of control. His obsession with gold, instead of consolidating his dominance, ended up fueling the strength of those who opposed him. What was once a symbol of supremacy ultimately sealed his downfall. In 1925, Aurora chose gold as the backbone of its global economy, while Monolythia bet on silver, believing its abundance would secure prosperity. But the strategy proved disastrous. As Aurora thrived with stability and confidence in its currency, Monolythia was trapped in a fragile economy. Silver, though valuable, was more volatile and lacked the same global acceptance as gold. Within decades, Monolythia's trade collapsed, its revenues dwindled, and its population fell into poverty and stagnation, watching as Aurora emerged as the world's financial leader. Aurora, after its financial crisis, has embraced the digital revolution with INT-ECHO, a cryptocurrency that promises transparency and stability. Meanwhile, Monolythia, clinging to its authoritarian rigidity, rejects innovation and returns to relying on gold, repeating the mistakes of the past. The world watches with irony as Monolythia condemns itself to stagnation, refusing to adopt the financial future. Time will tell whether Monolythia manages to survive its resistance to change or if, once again, it becomes trapped in the stagnation of its own decision. The continent that has historically been Aurora's ally is called Viridiana. For decades, Viridiana and Aurora built a cooperative relationship based on trade, technology, and economic stability. However, under Elios' leadership, this alliance was fractured due to his aggressive rhetoric and erratic decisions. Elios, with his boastful style, began accusing Viridiana's leaders of abusing the trust of Aurorian taxpayers, claiming that their inefficient bureaucracy drained resources without providing real benefits for Aurora. His insults escalated, calling them lazy, ineffective, and parasites of the financial system. The international press watched in disbelief as Elios showed contempt for a continent that had been key to Aurora's prosperity. The most alarming aspect was not only his words but his actions. Elios chose absolute isolation, withdrawing investments, severing trade agreements with Viridiana, closing embassies, and blocking cooperation initiatives. Instead of consolidating strategic alliances, he inadvertently strengthened his greatest adversary, Monolythia, which capitalized on the crisis to approach Viridiana and forge new commercial ties. Thus, the leader who vowed to make Aurora invincible ended up weakening it, eroding its global position, and handing influence to Monolythia, the nation that had always worked against Aurora's interests. Viridiana responded with determination. Initially surprised by Elios' accusations, its leaders pursued diplomacy. For years, Viridiana and Aurora had been strategic allies, driving the global economy together. But when Elios lashed out, calling them corrupt and lazy bureaucrats, Viridiana refused to stay silent. The continent took action. They rejected his statements and reminded Aurora that its decades of financial stability were built on mutual cooperation. Without hesitation, they redirected investments, sought new markets, and strengthened alliances with nations embracing the digital future. Elios was weakened. As Viridiana advanced, Aurora's isolation deepened. What was meant to be a strategy for dominance turned into the beginning of its downfall. What would have been unthinkable in another context was now becoming a reality. Monolythia was forging alliances with sectors that, until recently, would never have considered working with them. Not because its model represented an ideal of development, but because the discontent toward Elios was so profound that any alternative seemed preferable. Paradoxically, the aggression and lack of strategy of the Aurora leader ended up strengthening his main adversary, granting him an unexpected international influence. Aurora, once the undisputed symbol of technological and financial revolution, now found itself more isolated than ever. As Monolythia solidified its position on the global stage, the weakening of Elios became increasingly evident. His arrogance, once a mark of authority, now echoed like an empty boast. His relentless pursuit of an unshakable public image had eroded the trust of those who once saw him as a visionary leader. What was once his greatest strength had turned into his most glaring weakness, leaving Aurora at a crossroads of uncertainty. The world watched closely. Was this the beginning of the end, or the rebirth of a new era? Aurora, long accustomed to democracy and freedom, reacted immediately. The streets filled with protests as citizens demanded urgent change. The break with Viridiana was the tipping point. People wanted to rebuild diplomatic ties and restore Aurora's global position. As uncertainty grew, Elios clung to power, but both internal and external forces were already setting the pace for his inevitable fall. Aurora faces an unprecedented crisis. Its companies are losing markets while Monolythia extends its dominance. Even Monolythia's opponents in Viridiana are beginning to accept trade alliances with the regime, driven more by their rejection of Elios than by actual conviction. The Council of the Wise understands the urgency. They must act swiftly to prevent Aurora's collapse and stop Monolythia from rising as a global power. But every move must be carefully planned. A direct confrontation with Elios could trigger a larger conflict. With the country sinking into uncertainty and Elios becoming increasingly isolated, the council decides to act. Their strategy: internal reconstruction and international repositioning. First, they aim to restore citizens' trust through open forums and public debates, rekindling democratic dialogue. Then, they focus on forging strategic alliances to reclaim Aurora's stability on the global stage. The nation's fate hangs in the balance, and every decision will shape its future legacy. Aurora is on the brink of collapse, while Monolythia rises as an undeniable global power. The crisis sparked by Elios has not only weakened his own nation, but has also fueled the growth of his greatest adversary. Now, the Council of the Wise faces a race against time. They must sever Aurora's image from Elios before his stubbornness leads the country to its ultimate ruin. If they succeed in restoring internal confidence and rebuilding ties with Viridiana, Aurora still has hope. But if they fail, Monolythia will solidify its dominance like never before. The fate of Elios and Aurora. The outcome is uncertain, but the Council has taken action. Through diplomatic maneuvers and strategic reforms, they have stabilized the markets and averted total collapse. Aurora is reborn, though the scars of Elios's reign will remain in the collective memory. Elios, unable to accept his downfall, isolates himself within his inner circle, losing all clarity in governance. Meanwhile, Monolythia celebrates its unexpected victory. Its gold-based economy becomes a symbol of stability, attracting nations willing to trade with the regime rather than face Elios. But history is far from over. Aurora fights for its future. Monolythia grapples with the rigidity of its own model, and the world watches intently as the battle between past and future unfolds. Every twist, every struggle, and every victory have come to life because of you, the audience that has followed this story until the very end. Your attention, interest, and passion for Aurora's evolution have been essential. Stories are not just told, they are lived, and you have been witnesses to a world in constant transformation, where past and future collide in a battle for destiny. This is just one chapter in a narrative that continues to unfold. Thank you for being part of this journey.